Yesterday's show about the Indian Act generated a lot of feedback. Many people were genuinely shocked to hear the kind of race-based laws that we have in this country. I knew it was bad. I knew that Indians can't own their own property on Indian reserves, but I didn't know they're also, for example, forbidden to lease personal property too, like cars and trucks. Seriously, it's against the law just because they're Indian. And the Indian Act says they can't do it. I also didn't know that Indian farmers and ranchers are forbidden from selling any produce, any wheat, any meat, anything off the reserve. I mean, we just celebrated the end of the Canadian Wheat Board requiring white farmers to sell their wheat only to the government. Prime Minister Stephen Harper even flew out to a Saskatchewan wheat field for a photo op. And good for him, but now can he please set Indian farmers free too? Not just wheat farmers. The Indian Act bans the sale of anything from a farm, any crop, any animal, anything. And then there's the bizarre Indian Act section that says any Indian's last will and testament can be changed by the government just because he's an Indian, just because he lives on a reserve. Did you even know about this? I didn't until I read it yesterday. But surely people who work in the Indian industry, the thousands of bureaucrats in Ottawa, the thousands of Indian chiefs and other Indian politicians who enforce the Indian Act every day know about it. How could you work in such a system and not be disgusted by it? How could you allow it to continue? How could you be silent about all of this? Well, that's the thing. It's in the personal and financial interest of the Indian industry to perpetuate itself. Everyone I mentioned above, the consultants, the lawyers, the bureaucrats, the politicians, well, they make a handsome living off the system. Of course they do, because Indians are the most overgoverned, overregulated people in North America. So there's actually a lot of jobs involved with bossing them around, lots of jobs stopping them from setting up farms, lots of jobs being nosy and revoking Indians' wills. A lot of those jobs are, of course, jobs for white folks, politicians, bureaucrats, lawyers, consultants. That white judge at the federal court, remember we talked about him, Michael Phelan, who recently ruled that there was no evidence of financial mismanagement at Attawapiskat. He's part of the Indian industry too, who perpetuates this soft apartheid. But plenty of real Indians have been co-opted also. I mean, just look again at the payroll of the Attawapiskat Indian Reserve, a little town with less than 2,000 people, and look at that. 3 chiefs on the payroll, 18 band counselors. That's like 3 mayors and 18 aldermen, all getting full-time paychecks, tax-free, for running a town that's smaller than my high school's population. And then there's the school board of Attawapiskat and the health board, and they all get paid. And that's all on top of the full-time bureaucrats. That's the Indian industry. So you see, if you're lucky enough to be one of the Indians on the top of the heap, the 1%ers, let's call them, well, you'll do fine. But do you think the chief of the Attawapiskat band lives in a house with a leaky roof and no heat? Do you think her boyfriend, who just happens to be the financial officer there, lives in a shanty? No, of course not. They're the 1%ers at Attawapiskat. They have enormous power over everything in their town, from housing to healthcare. Power that you and I would never grant to our mayors in Toronto or wherever else we are. Like I said, it's an Indian industry. I think a lot of Canadians know something's wrong, something's going on with the Indian Act, but we're just afraid to talk about it publicly for fear of being called racist. I mean, that's the ultimate silver bullet in politically correct arguing, isn't it? As Rush Limbaugh taught us years ago, the definition of the word bigot is anyone who's winning an argument against a liberal. So if you start pointing out how the Indian Act is racist, or how Indian chiefs are really just like white politicians, just as greedy, just as partisan, just as corrupt as white guys, well, you'll be called a racist to shut you up. I think that a lot of ordinary Canadians feel genuine sympathy for the plight of Indians, that historically they've been mistreated, and that we should do better for them today. But there's cognitive dissonance, there's confusion here, because we spend so much money but get so little results from Indian affairs. Attawapiskat is a microcosm of that. $90 million has been sent there for social services by the federal Conservatives in the last 5 years. $90 million. Yet they're still living in leaky shacks. They built a hockey arena and bought a Zamboni and shipped it in instead of rebuilding the school that they tore down. So there's cognitive dissonance, there's confusion here. If it were a white town, we'd send in the auditors or even the RCMP to check for fraud. But because we call them chiefs instead of mayors and other politicians, we get cold feet and say, yeah, better not sound racist, just shovel more money at the reserve. That's what Judge Phelan essentially did. His ruling the other day on the federal court, claiming there was no evidence of malfeasance in Attawapiskat, was the soft bigotry of low expectations. He was essentially saying, hell, they're Indians. That's what it's like there. Instead of saying, these are Canadians who deserve better. I want to show you just a few responses from the official Indian industry that I got last night after my comments on that show went to air. Here's one comment from Will Gooden. He writes about I'll just quote his tweet. He says, how about you leave a subject alone you're clueless about? That's what he was saying to me. Well, I'm not clueless about Attawapiskat anymore. I've looked through their financial statements, and I'm not clueless about the Indian Act anymore. I've read it. Now, I might not be affected by the Indian Act personally. I'm not living under it, but I am morally responsible for what happens in Canada. At least a little bit I am, as much as Canadians would be, say, in the fight against South African apartheid 25 years ago. But who is Will Gooden telling me to shut up? Well, he's a Métis activist, which is great. But that's my point. He's not governed by the Indian Act himself. He's an Aboriginal, but he has the right to own property. He just doesn't want me cutting into his action and talking about other Aboriginals who don't have his rights. Or take this guy, Ryan Bowie, who wrote, and I quote, unsurprisingly, this is a complete mischaracterization of the financial facts and a racist rant. Look, I've gone through the financial statements. We had a senior accountant on the show yesterday who said what's going on in Attawapiskat is unacceptable. Now multiply that by hundreds of Indian reserves. A racist rant? Seriously, you're going to defend the racist Indian Act, a law that gives and takes away rights based on race, by calling me a racist for wanting us to all be equal before the law? I want Indians to have property rights. He doesn't. But I'm the racist? Who is this Ryan Bowie anyways? Well, like Will Gooden, like Judge Fellon, he's a part of the Indian industry. He's a PhD candidate at York University studying Indian governance. He's a junior industry Indian consultant in training. He's going to get rich off this law, so why would he want to change it, right? Look, half the arguments against me last night were my use of the word Indian itself. Well, it is called the Indian Act. They are called Indian bands. Sorry, that's the word. I know they're not really from India, but they're called Indians. Most real Indians I know call themselves Indians. It takes a PhD to make a fuss about Indian versus First Nation versus Aboriginal or whatever. But that's my point too. Imagine caring more about the title of the law called the Indian Act than caring about what's actually in the law. It's like what our professor friend David Bradley told us about the N-word in the book Huckleberry Finn. He's for keeping the word in the book, by the way. Remember what David Bradley said? He said that you can use the word African American instead of black. You can even use the word sir. But if you don't actually change the real life conditions for black people in America, what's the point of saying African American other than to come across as fashionable? I say the same thing to all the liberals who think that just by saying First Nations or First Peoples, they're so high-minded that they don't have to actually change the law that forbids those same nations and peoples from owning property or even having the right to make their own will. We can win this fight, my friends, not for our own benefit, although all of us will benefit from having a more harmonious, more just, more free Canada. We will win this fight for ordinary Indians, the 99% of them who aren't fancy chiefs in the Assembly of First Nations Millionaires Club, or the PhD professors, or the federal court judges. We can win this fight for the 99% of citizens in Attawapiskat who aren't on the band council milking that teat for all it's worth. We can win this for the Indians who call themselves Indian and who frankly don't give a damn about which term is more exquisitely proper, First Nations or First Peoples, because they're just too busy trying to live in an apartheid system that the liberal elites keep propping up.